Hey everyone, welcome back to the Beat Your Genes podcast. This is episode number 329. And a couple episodes ago, we ended a show with me asking Dr. Howk about some of the critiques of the twin studies and the work of Robert Plomin. So in this episode, we finally get to hear those critiques along with a spirited discussion between Dr. Lisle and Dr. Howk about the twin studies, personality, behavioral genetics, and perhaps some of the mismatch in logic behind some of those critiques. One thing I wanted to mention is that throughout this episode, I actually mentioned a paper by Turkheimer, and I actually made a mistake. The paper cites Turkheimer a lot, but it's actually written by J. Joseph. So I'll put a link to the paper down below if anyone wants to read it. And just remember, anytime Turkheimer's paper is mentioned, just know that what I meant to say was J. Joseph. All right, let's get to the video for the fruit.
Sounds delicious. Yes. Well, I don't have a lot of faith that any of these will ever bear fruit. They're just for my entertainment. But the avocados might. That's possible. But yeah, it's nice to have big tropical plants around.
Yep. All good.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Well, what have we got going?
Well, today we've got some questions we've got different questions. I wanted to see if, so last time, Dr. Howk, when you were on, we kind of ended the show about the twin studies and some of the critiques about it. And I wanted to hear a little bit more your thoughts on it and kind of see, I was reading a little bit about the critiques. I think there was a guy, Turkheimer, who had this 38-page paper about the critiques. I read through it all. It didn't really make a lot of good points in my mind. Like I still agreed with Plomin. But I wanted to hear your thoughts. You'd mentioned there's some things about the twin studies that maybe there were some critiques on, and I want to hear your thoughts on it. And then Dr. Lisle as well.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I don't have all of that stuff right in front of me, so I can't give you a full, I feel like I'm being put on.
No,
the
you're
spot
not going to be cross-examined, I promise.
But it's just like, once you've been through grad school, you have comps PTSD. But cite the study and the year and everything.
No, don't worry about that.
So no, there's a bunch of critiques. Turkheimer is, best known for it, but there are other people around, and I think they're all making similar kinds of criticisms. So it's not so much that the idea of the approach is flawed. I think everybody agrees that in principle, this would be the way to establish, if you want to settle the nature nurture debate, this is the way to do it. So I think they're mostly just on methodological grounds. And so some of the critiques I found the most salient or interesting were there's not a lot of consistency across the board as to the age of these twins when they're separated, for example. So in some studies, the twins are quite old. And I don't remember if Turkheimer brings this up or not, but some of these studies,
and they only spent 11 years apart or something. Yeah.
Well, there's some of those, but even the childhood, I think we have this idea that it's this methodologically sort of pure state where you have these twins that are separated right after the moment of birth, and they're immediately spirited away to totally opposite sides of the tracks, and they are raised in totally different environments. And that's just very rarely the case. And if you think about it for a few minutes, you realize, well, yeah, what usually happens is we've got a mother in trouble. She's not really giving up these kids willingly. She's in a situation where this has to happen. And so what's happening is that the kids are kind of in the foster care system for a long time, or they're going through a process that takes years, where they might be both living with mom, or they might be kind of in and out with mom for a while. And then eventually one's going to live with grandma, or one's going to go live with another family member or something. Sometimes they remain in the same school for a while. Often they remain in touch for a while. And it's just that all of these things don't diminish the findings of the literature. They might reduce the effect size of given studies. And it's just the kind of idea that you can't paint with a broad brush across the entire literature this methodological purity that we would hope to impose onto what's happening here, that every study has its limitations, and you want to be sensitive to things like that, and that there are these environmental the lingering environmental effects that are going on until their age of separation at 18 months, at 4 years, at 11 years, whatever it is, that's going to be driving the results in a lot of them. And it's just muddying the waters a little bit. So those were the things that stood out the most to me as, oh, okay, well, those are significant problems. Like it's not as pure a state as I would hope to deduce some information from it. So those are some of the critiques. One of the other things that bothered me a lot is that I don't know if Turkheimer again is among this crew, but some of the people who have been the most vigorous critics have had trouble replicating the data. They've had trouble accessing the data. There's been a lot of sort of circling the wagons and protecting the original studies and the original data and not letting other researchers have access to it. And that's usually on privacy grounds, but those kinds of things can be worked around. You can make privacy claims in any area of research, but that's not an excuse to not make your data available to other people who might want to replicate the study. So the fact that there's kind of this spirit of, we're not going to share this with people who might critique us, rubs me the wrong way. I don't like seeing that at all. And I don't know enough to know, again, how widespread that is, how big a problem it is. These are just little chinks in the armor of this body of work that, so much is premised upon. And I just want to know more about that. So I've run into those things, a few other things, but those are the highlights.
Does it measurably change your conclusions? Do these kind of methodological flaws, is it enough to change the conclusions, or is it more just, it just introduces a little bit of doubt, and so that's just, that doubt needs to be known?
It certainly could on individual studies. I think what Doug would probably chime in with here is that, it's a vast enough body of work, and there have been enough meta studies, and there's sort of, after you have 15 million pairs, if you've got a couple of studies where the twins weren't separated until they were 8 or whatever, that washes out across the huge vastness of the literature, which is why I'm not sitting here saying we have to throw all of this out and it's not significant and it doesn't matter. It's just, it warrants a slightly closer eye at any given study. If you're going to hitch your wagon to any one particular study that's looking at some very rarefied trait that hasn't been replicated, I really want to dig deep into what was going on at the level of all of these assumptions that we might be making of the literature as a whole, but that might not apply to any given study. That's all, and that's what we do in social science all the time.
Excellent.
All good.
Yeah, I don't recall. Doug might know better what Turkheimer's beef really is.
Well, Turkheimer, I know him a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know he is, he's going to be, he's deeply psychodynamic.
Turkheimer?
Eric Turkheimer is psychodynamic.
In secret?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not even that secret. Okay.
It seemed that way reading his thing.
Yes. So the thing is that Eric Turkheimer is one of the more schizophrenic scientists that you're ever going to run into. In other words, he is somewhere in that twisted head, he believes in Sigmund Freud. On the other hand, he's a very smart guy, very capable person mathematically. So he's staring the evidence in the face that it's bullshit. So you wind up watching a dog chasing its tail. And that's Eric Turkheimer. So I haven't read this 38-page article, but that makes sense. That's a very smart behavior geneticist that made his career in behavior genetics. He was smart enough and open-minded enough, and he also smelled the coffee. In other words, he was a young scientist that got his first job, was basically hired by Sandra Scar. And Sandra Scar being an icon in behavior genetics, that left Harvard and then became the head of the department at the University of Virginia. And so Eric Turkheimer would have been, I don't know the exact story, but Eric Turkheimer clearly was a major recruit of Sandra Scar's, and came along with Irving Gottesman, who is the icon in the MZ twin genetics and schizophrenia researcher, the most prominent genetics and schizophrenia researcher in the 20th century. And so, so Turkheimer came in as a young assistant professor at UVA, and he knew that he was going to make his bones in behavior genetics. There was no question that that's what he was brought there to do, and he had the brains to do it. Not a lot of young professors of clinical psychology. I think his PhD's out of the University of Minnesota. So, which is, by the way, for our listeners that you wouldn't know, that is the Harvard of clinical psychology. In other words, University of Minnesota is as blue-blooded as it gets. So I believe Turkheimer came out of Minnesota, and obviously Minnesota is the heart and soul of the Minnesota Twin Studies. But it also has but the Minnesota Twin Studies are not necessarily sitting inside the University of Minnesota Psychology Department. It can be their own animal. So the Minnesota Psychology Department, and including, I think, Eric Turkheimer as a grad student there, not a small psychodynamic streak. So
Turkheimer was, just according to Wikipedia, he actually got his PhD at University of Texas. Lee Willerman and John Lowen.
Okay, my mistake. So I sniffed a Minnesota connection there somewhere.
There might be a postdoc or something.
Might have been a postdoc or something.
Yeah.
So, but at any rate, the point is that Turkheimer was known to be a gifted young man who was going to be a star in behavior genetics, and he was coming right under the wing of Gottesman and Scar, and so he knew he was right. He knew that that's where the evidence was, and he knew that everybody in the damn country didn't want to hear it. This, if you've got any guts at all and you've got some protection, hey, I'm going to be able to publish because you guys aren't going to be able to stop me because I'm going to have data that nobody else has because they're not willing to look. And so he made his bones in behavior genetics, but strangely enough, sitting under there is a psychoanalytic thinker. And so now he finds himself, the conclusion goes to Plomin. In other words, Plomin is just saying, hey, it's genetic, and we can tell because everything that we see about any ordinal direction of a pair of twin pairs on any dimension is stochastic. You measure it 3 years later and it reverses. So therefore there isn't one that's this way or that way, better or worse, etc. In other words, it's a scramble, which is telling you that all you're watching when you're looking at the systematic differences in MZ twins, basically, not entirely, but pretty much what you're looking at is just the vicissitudes of human life and the dynamics of human life experience as it changes from hour to hour and from month to month. Of course, okay? So it's, but Turkheimer staring at that, there's nowhere to run. So in other words, there's not a single scrap of evidence that any childhood experience, the warmth or coldness of the parent, that any of these processes have any lasting effect on any measurement that you could ever have in personality. Now, another critique that I don't know if it's in his paper, but another critique is, well, gee, these are all just a bunch of survey research. You people aren't out there actually measuring behavior. It's like, yeah, that's true. We're all we're doing is we've got survey research because that's the only practical way to go about the processes of looking at personality. And of course, of course that's going to be sloppy as hell. But we're going to have to reasonably assume that if someone says that they like to go to parties and talk to a bunch of people, that we're going to assume that that person is more extroverted than somebody that says, no, I don't like to go to parties and I don't like to hang out with people. It's like, it's not as good as actually following a camera around or a monitor and then watching people's behavior, etc. But it's the most practical and completely legitimate and ecologically valid thing that you've got. So, of course, we can use it. And we have to assume that the slop that you see in that system evens out not in favor of any hypothesis. And so, I believe that Eric Turkheimer has been cornered by the evidence of his own research career. but with it comes behind that, and I do not think this is coincidental. It also comes behind a very ugly, scary issue that is incredibly non-PC. And so Robert Plomin, beautifully, and being an older person than Turkheimer by 10 years, already had his career going and already was smelling this and knew that there was reasons to be intimidated politically, and writes about that in Blueprint. He knew damn well that this was dangerous and he was going to be called a fascist and everything else. But he was just that much more protected, in terms of how old he is and what the career looks like, I believe, than Turkheimer. I think Plomin is 6 or 7 years than Turkheimer. We'd have to look it up, but I think he is. And so, so I think Turkheimer, there's a tiny, tiny little phase shift there that is probably not trivial in terms of just general social pressure in academia around this. But Turkheimer, you can only get so controversial and survive. And so I don't think Turkheimer had the stomach or the soul. In other words, in his soul, he's a Freudian. And so it's like, somewhere in there, it speaks to him that early childhood trauma is having a big influence. And so a lot of people think that. Almost the entire world thinks that. So to sort of educate yourself out of that and stare at your own data, can't find it. I mean, and then what are you going to do when all of the data says no? What are you going to do? You can hear that the entire world is behind you if you attack a Plomin position. Everybody's going to be behind you. The Plomin's out there by himself, okay? And the entire woke world of academia is sitting on the other side of the fence on this thing. They don't want any part of it. And so I think that's who Eric Turkheimer is. I'm pretty damn sure of it. I mean, I'm talking out of turn. I haven't had long conversations with this dude, but I was around the University of Virginia. I was a grad student when he was a young professor there. People had his classes. People were talking about Eric Turkheimer. I actually knew, I have some more data on Turkheimer. I know that there's a Freudian soul in there, okay? And it's pretty deep, to the point where, quote, the correct way, there are rules to psychotherapy, and you don't do this and you don't do that because the rules are, quote, the rules of Sigmund Freud. So that stuff's bandying around inside that guy's head. You can just imagine, wow, you're a leading behavior geneticist, and your research involves the mathematical analysis of this data, and yet deep in your heart, or somewhere in there's a lurking big time Freudian. You get a 38-page critique that doesn't really have any teeth in it. That makes sense to me. And you can point out all these little questions, but to me, it synthesizes down to the following thing. If you can't show any correlation coefficient between adoptive children and their adopted parents, if you can't show that, then where the hell do you have anything that indicates any environmental influence? So obviously there are some chains in causality there that you wouldn't have to be correlated, but it would have to be negatively correlated. In other words, controlling bitch adoptive mother leads to reclusive resistant child. In other words, it's got to be something. Or controlling bitch mother leads to controlling bitch adoptive daughter. There has to be some correlation coefficient somewhere. Or, oh no, in this case, if you're a controlling bitch, it turns out that the daughter's more unstable. Okay, well then show it to me in another 50 people. In other words, somewhere there has to be a theory that says that the behavior and characteristics of a parent or childhood rearing practices has some influence, some correlation coefficient on some outcome somewhere. And it's like, well, you got nothing. You got 50 years of this research and you have absolutely nothing. What do you have? bundle all of that together, and all of it put together, and every single scrap you've ever had doesn't sum to 1% of the variance. And genetics is 50% of the variance. So therefore, and then all the rest of the variance that you see, it isn't, quote, environmental influence, it's stochastic. You can't even predict what the hell that variance is. Okay. Well, then you come to what I consider to be the obvious inference, which is that that is the limits of personality. Because the rest of life is all of the completely unpredictable cost-benefit analytics that go on in any person's behavior pattern. Two MZ twins are not going to have exactly the same life. And by the way, Steven Pinker then goes further in The Blank Slate, and I did not actually read this employment, and I don't know, Jen, kind of what goes on in your head behind this. But Steven Pinker said something really interesting, and I have not actually seen follow-up evidence. It might have been employment, but I didn't see it, not that I can remember, which is that he says, listen, clones are not identical. If you breed fruit flies in a bottle that are genetically identical, the truth of the matter is they all look different. And that's because their inherent developmental process is, winds up being that one of them winds up with a goofy looking wing and the other one doesn't. And so it only shows up in 1 in 27 of those fruit flies, but 1 in 27 of them has this and another 1 in 27 has that. And what Pinker inferred out of this, and it's not referenced, but it's a fascinating argument, is that actually the big impact of environment is not in the developmental process of the human, it's in utero.
And that's another big critique of the twin studies, is that they're completely dispensing with any developmental shared effect in utero. That this just doesn't, we're just going to wipe that out of the analysis. And so it's an interesting point, and it would, if Pinker's assumption and that of the critics is correct, like that's diminishing the effect as well.
Yes, but
By how much?
Here's the thing. No, Nathan, here's the biggest issue.
Okay.
The biggest issue is, Lita Cosmides wrote once, I think she was talking about Don Simons, and she said, I think this is attributed to Don Simons, that you can't understand people, what they're arguing, unless you understand who they're arguing against. And you're not going to be able to understand me and my frustration with this issue unless you understand who I'm arguing against. So I'm not arguing against somebody that says, hey, listen, the genetics only has X amount, literally the genetic code, because after that in utero, there's a bunch of random effects that take place in utero early in development of the brain, and then that's what it is. It's like, that doesn't bother me in the slightest if that's true. What bothers me is the idea that, oh, this kid had a cold mother, and that cold mother, then he was really disappointed bitterly over a period of time because the sister was treated better. And that's why he's having trouble with his boss that reminds him of his mother 30 years later. That's the bullshit I'm arguing against. And I'm arguing from the standpoint that there's not a single scrap of evidence anytime after birth, all the way to a person's 30th birthday. In other words, the entire developmental process of child raising and parenting decisions, and how much help you had with school, and whether or not your dad was a drug addict, like all of that kind of stuff. It's like it amounts to nothing. And yet these are exactly, when people talk about environment, they're not talking about little in utero differences that makes one twin slightly more outgoing than the other because there's a slight difference in what the hell happened in utero chemistry from the left side of the womb to the right side of the womb on the other MC twin. No, we're not arguing about that. Nobody's arguing. Is that a legitimate thing to bring up when it comes to assigning percentage of variance to genes versus environment? Sure, we could call it, but let's call it three things then. We're going to call it genetic. We're going to call it inherent by the time you're born, and then we're going to call everything else. Okay. So everything that happens after you're born, and I will argue they don't have shit to indicate that anything happens that after you're born has any systematic influence on your personality whatsoever. And so that, the fact that hell, there may be quite a bit that happens in utero that is actually, but even then, it's like, really? So which one winds up where, you're telling me that that's a percentage of the variance, that MZ twin 1 versus MZ twin 2, something happens in utero and that's why they're little. I can buy that, but what difference does it make? You don't have any control over that. What are you going to do then? Sleep on your left side for one night and then sleep on your right side for the other night so we balance it out? I mean, it's insane. And there's no evidence that one co-twin is superior to another co-twin on a host of characteristics. You're talking about random effects models here. So my argument is not against some legitimate scientific curiosity about the random effects that are taking place in utero that drives them. It's the differences between MC twins. I couldn't care less about that. What I'm arguing against is the Freudian model that believes that when children have their penis or vagina touched when they're 2 months old, when their diaper's being changed, that creates a tiny little crack in the integrity of that individual's personality. And that in fact, what will happen with little stressors later, that as we get increasing stressors and then they're embarrassed in the second grade because they peed on the floor and, and then in class and then everybody saw it. In other words, all of these things that people can very much relate to because they're like, boy, I had embarrassing things that happened to me. Boy, I had traumatic things that happened to me. Is that the reason why I am the way I am? And I'm arguing, no, that is not the reason why you are the way you are. It has absolutely nothing to do with it. And people will argue, well, I think it does. It's like, well, you're wrong. That's not the reason why you are the way you are. It's the reason why you had that experience and you had that memory. You can have traumatic things in your memory that are going to be sitting as warning flags to you of losses in the future under similar circumstances. And therefore, you have a life history that is coding for some anxiety and avoidance under future possible losses. That is true. But that did not change your personality as we use the word personality. You could say it changes your personality if you consider personality to be the entire study of all individual differences in humans that are not merely physical. Okay, so it's like, okay, you could call it that if you want to add everything that you know inside your mind to what we call personality, but that's not what I call personality. What I call personality is the typical orientation of that person as they approach, the circumstances in their existence. What do they seek out? What do they like? And what do they avoid, et cetera, et cetera. Those things, I'm telling you, I'm 64 years old. Those things don't change. I meet people. I've watched people grow. I've watched people, start it when I met them at 14, and then I see them at 35. No, those characteristics are not changing. Okay, so and trauma is not causing people to quote lose it and then completely lose their way. So I'm telling you what will cause people to lose their way, which is something different than traumatic events. It's drugs. Okay, drugs absolutely will. Drugs damage humans' brains. They massively, tremendously distort their ability to run cost-benefit analysis. That you want to see personality change in human beings? Watch somebody struggling with a drug addiction. Now, if they get out of the addiction, are they changed? No. In other words, if they haven't done too much brain damage, they will recover, quote, their native personality. But while they're under that influence, hell, that's some pretty chaotic stuff. But yeah, I'm arguing against somebody touched my pee-pee and now that's going to make me an introvert or an extrovert 28 years from now. That sits inside of every frickin' psychodynamic psychotherapist. And it sits inside of Eric Turkheimer. And the thing is that his pushing back and equivocation about what is clearly, I consider the clearly accurate and courageous inferences that are made by Plowman, I think it's bullshit. In other words, smart guy, interesting guy. I'm stealing one of his great analogies to put in this book. He's a, I'm not saying that Eric Turkheimer is not an A-list thinker, but I'm telling you, the defense that he would have for early environmental influence is he may come by it honestly or he may come by it dishonestly. I don't really know, but I could see how he could come by it honestly and therefore be a guy chasing his tail trying to defend something that he can't actually defend empirically. So this reminds me, I'll shut up in a minute. This reminds me of there was a major statistician professor that wrote a blistering self-satisfied critique of the Bruce Ryan data. And of course, they published this in Psych Bulletin or wherever it is that Bruce Ryan published. And it showed about all these assumptions that the Ryan Ryan team made that were incorrect statistically. It was very interesting to read it. And you're reading it and it's impressive. It's like, you didn't do this, you don't have homogeneity variances here, you've assumed this, you've assumed that, therefore your numbers are off. And I'm reading it and I'm thinking, well, this guy knows more about stats than I do. He's a stats professor at the University of Iowa or where the hell he was. And I'm like, yeah, I wonder what Ryan is going to say about this. I mean, I understand statistics. I mean, I already know that Ryan is already showing that it's less than 1% of the variance in the outcome. So therefore, this could be attributed to having been sexually abused. So I already know it's nothing. But still, it's like, well, how bad did they do this and how bad could it get? What would it look like if you changed all of these assumptions? Well, that's exactly what the Ryan team did. They went back and gave that guy's critique the benefit of the doubt to the nth degree on every single one of those assumptions and changed them. And it changed the numbers from 0.9% of the variance to 1.0. It changed it to 1/10 of 1% of the variance. That's as much as you could squeeze out of that orange. And that's what I believe that the essentially the environmentalists are chasing. And it's like, why are you so defensive about this? Why don't we just stare the world in the face and look at exactly what we're seeing? Because what we're seeing is that personality is not changeable. And that, I don't know. There's a whole bunch of reasons why people are defensive as hell about that and don't want to stare at it. But I haven't read the Turkheimer paper, so I don't know all the ingenious arguments that he makes. But man, I don't see how an honest man argues with Plowman. Anyway, that's what I think.
Yeah, Dr. Howk, what say you?
Oh, I think there are a million different interesting ways to go from that. And so a lot of it, I mean, Doug is touching on it with the kind of idea of, you've used this phrase before, Doug, of like, overcoding early childhood experiences. Instead of let's just get away from trauma language entirely because that's so triggering to people. And it's like, everybody gets defensive all over the place with this stuff. And so let's just try to bring the temperature down on that. So early uncomfortable or unpleasant experiences in childhood that you somehow overcoded some defensiveness around that. And this is, this can be our analogy with the deer in the woods that nearly gets eaten by the fox. That's going to be hesitant to go back to that same little patch of grass next week. And there definitely are in many of our, to use a word from the kids these days, lived experiences, a sense that you are overly cautious about that patch of grass because there was a fox there before and something bad happened and you don't want to go back there. And that can become, and this is the analogy that I've been using, the childhood trauma is like learning to drive. You practice driving on the right side of the road long enough, and it's not as if you can't drive on the left side of the road. You certainly can. You can learn those skills. You can get uncomfortable and practice with it, but it's not habitual. It's not easy for you. And I think this is like, Doug, what you've talked about too with freeway fear. The longer you tell yourself you're afraid of driving on the freeway and you don't drive on the freeway and you go years without driving on the freeway, pretty soon we're terrified of ever driving on the freeway. The fear is bigger 20 years later than it originally started off as when you first had a scary incident on the freeway and decided never to drive on the freeway again. So I think people's inference of how trauma is affecting them or changing their personality. I'm the kind of person who's really afraid to drive in heavy traffic or to drive on the freeway. It is being affected by experiences. It is an environment that was an overcoded environmental thing that happened that sort of got this little runaway process in the way that you see the world. And maybe people around you validated that in ways, or maybe you just never, you essentially never overwrote that code. You continued to validate it throughout your life. And this can happen in relationships that you're choosing. It can happen in things that you're afraid of confronting. It can happen in all sorts of ways. And so we call that personality, but Doug's making the point that that's not really personality. This is just how we're interacting with the world, and how we're sorting out our values and our fears with relationship to it. And so I think there's room for these perspectives to have a seat at the table and not actually be as adversarial as sometimes it's set up to be, with like this, are you team nature or are you team nurture? Pick a side. And you know, if you're on the wrong side, you're just wrong and I'm not even going to talk to you. I think a lot of it is a define your terms kind of situation. And what are we actually talking about? What are we actually trying to measure? Certainly there are the linkages to essential personality traits that are fundamentally affected by these early experiences, and the ways in which those are invalidated by the twin studies does seem quite convincing, as Doug's laying out. But I think there's space for, okay, well, what's maybe not big five personality, but we think of as something essential to who it is that we are, or something that is really having a profound effect on how we're able to live our life, or it's constraining the choices we're able to make, or it feels confining in some way. And this is the thing I've talked about in the last couple of True to Lives too, like what's really you? What's the real you? What's a kind of some sort of coping mechanism, for lack of a better word, or some kind of strategy to manage your relationships or to manage your place in the world that may very well have been informed from early environmental experiences or environmental experiences at any point across your lifespan. So I don't think it's as there's not as much there with this disagreeable kind of conflict that we sometimes map onto it. I think it's a messy area, and depending on how you frame the discussion, you can make up a lot of ground on these things.
Yeah, I think it is very adversarial. Okay. So I think it's very adversarial in the sense that the psychologists of the world and psychiatrists of the world and the social workers of the world that believe what they believe are wrong. They are fundamentally wrong about what it is that why it is that the person is the way it is that they are observing. And so they're way off. There's a some of the things that you're saying are obviously correct. You can have experiences that are intimidating because you lose something, you have losses, and those losses can intimidate you. However, I want to explain something about the nature of motivation that will largely contradict painting a significant amount of human experience down that direction, and certainly anything that would even come close to we would be calling an entrenched trait of an individual. And that is that the people and animals are designed by nature to run pretty good analyses on what it is that they are capable of doing and what the dangers and opportunities are in the environment. If you get burned on something, it would be incredibly evolutionarily disastrous if you experienced loss X, but you experienced that loss because you had every reason to believe that you were going to gain Y. So you tried to gain Y, and in fact, you got loss X. And so as a result of that, you're a little bit confused about why it is that you had that failure. I thought I should be safe, but my dad's whacking me. I got careful about not insulting him or staying away from him when he was intoxicated, but I got beat up anyway. Okay. So what we're going to have is losses need to result in analysis. And those analyses, first of all, they are cued by negative feelings. So negative feedback, a loss is simply nothing other than something that reduces the statistical likelihood of survival or reproduction. It's just a gene survival truth that you either increased or that situation that you just lived through either increased or decreased your likelihood of gene survival. Your brain can calculate that, and it's designed by nature to calculate that. And then what it does next is it orients you with a thing called feelings. So feelings are nothing other than analogs of the mathematical analysis of whether that thing increased or decreased the likelihood of gene survival and by how much. So if the individual has a loss experience, they are designed by nature to analyze why. And they're designed by nature to do a very smart analysis. There's no point in doing an analysis unless you can be accurate about it. Otherwise, the whole machinery of the brain that would lead to that analysis is completely and utterly evolutionarily worthless. The entire point of being able to do that analysis is to arrive at very reasonable and, in fact, Darwinianly profitable inferences. Okay? Those Darwinian profitable inferences in general are accurate. Okay, and they aren't firm. They are hypotheses that have little standard deviations of standard errors of estimate around them. So a person who feels like they just got burned because, you know, Susie was too cute and dumped me. Okay, well, one hypothesis was that you were reaching a little too high. Another hypothesis is that Susie, you know, you weren't quite her type. Another hypothesis is that she's a bitch. There's several different hypotheses here. But getting dumped by Susie is not going to stop this guy from looking at the landscape of opportunity and threat and actually taking another shot at it and trying. He will be testing hypotheses. And it's going to turn out that if you have a hypothesis, even if it's been socially pounded into you by a bunch of other people, you're not completely 100% trapped by what anybody says. If your dad tells you you're ugly and worthless, hey, that's not what the boys at school are saying. That's not what my teacher at school is saying. That's not what my grade on my English test is saying, even if nobody's talking to me. I got a B+ on the test. How stupid can I be? The human being is not designed by nature to take one bit of data or a series of data from a single individual and map that onto all of the opportunities that they're going to face for the rest of their lives. They are, in fact, a constant hypothesis tester. So if the rabbit damn near gets killed by the fox, it now learns something. It learns that in that space or under those conditions, it was more vulnerable than it knew. So it had something to learn, and it will be sensitized. There's no doubt about that. When people get burned, when things go wrong, you should be sensitized. You didn't see something coming. You had a vulnerability you didn't know was there. And so the brain should code for anxiety and trepidation around similar patterns of stimulation in the future. But it shouldn't make the worst case possible scenario estimates and then leave them there indefinitely for 25 years. There's no way in hell that that's the way it works.
Unless there is gain to be had from that socially, which we talk about in the book and I talk about in my dissertation. Like now we've flipped it around where there is an incentive to, I have greater survival and reproductive payoff if I wallow in my fear. And so the landscape has changed on that to some degree. And I think there's natural variation across the population of rabbits afraid of foxes, and also of people who got spooked by something and how willing they are to go out and hypothesis test. And so you look at that variation, and then you look at changing incentives in the environment where, okay, you know, I kind of a scared little rabbit and I see an avenue for social inclusion and validation and status by affirming my fear and affirming my my habits around not hypothesis testing, like doing exactly the opposite of what I should be doing as a healthy animal. And now you've got, you know, a lot of this kind of runaway process going on.
Yeah.
So that complicates the picture too.
No argument. In other words, the human being now more than ever has a more complicated bunch of ways to optimize their response to the environment with respect to having had an experience like that. So it's like, hey, if you can get some kind of a payoff for having gone through a loss and bitching about it, and then never even facing that challenge again, if there's enough payoffs, then you might just sit there forever. Again, native personality is going to have a big influence on that. But that, I mean, you make hugely important points there. But none of those points have anything to do with actually the central argument between me and the psychodynamic and learning theory personality theorists. Okay. Yeah. All of those things those are all super interesting and useful things to be aware of. But the fundamental notion that you bruise the banana at age 4 and it's partially wrecked permanently, that's why it is that you're seeing the behavior you're seeing at 34, is because of the shit that went down when it was 4. And I absolutely categorically reject that. I accept the faint possibility that under certain conditions you're going to have what is known as an eggshell plaintiff in the law. And that is that if you tap some little lady's bumper in her old Dodge at 2 miles an hour, and it turns out that she has such severe osteoporosis that she breaks her neck, you're online for it. And so is your insurance company. If it's $2 million, it's $2 million. It's like, and you're like, I barely touched her. I was going 1 mile an hour. Yeah, that's called the eggshell plaintiff. That's what that is. And so I have no doubt at all that there are eggshell plaintiffs out there in personality where I don't even know that I believe that. You know, but I almost have to believe it because something not dissimilar is true physically. So there are going to be, but I mean, I will swear the eggshell plaintiff people that I've seen psychologically, their whole damn life was like that. They were always anxious nutcases. They were always hyperactive, complaining, you know, woe is me.
But the difference for those human animals, we haven't quite hashed this out before, so it's interesting, is like you think of like what an evolutionary mistake it would be for the rabbit to be an eggshell plaintiff and to say, I'm never going to go eat grass again. It's going to die, right? Like it can't go back and bitch around the campfire and be like, oh, you poor little bunny, and let's give you extra, you know, candy tonight, and we're going to take extra care of you. Humans can. And I think there's a gendered overlay to this too, where women are more susceptible to those kinds of social dynamics than men, all things equal. But that, you know, with the last 10 or 15 years or so with social media and the rise of victim culture, you have now it's equal opportunity for we're not animals in the wild who are going to wither away and die, and if we don't go out there and eat the grass, where we have an alternative strategy available to us, and that's a consequence of our unique social ecology and the culture in which we're embedded. So it's a very the instinct is in there in a way in humans that it is not in the animal kingdom, and that's there's that distinction. And so you put us into an environment that creates an opportunity structure for it. It's gonna run wild. It's gonna go crazy.
That's so good. We never quite identified that concept.
Distinguished that. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, we're a unique animal. We throw ourselves a pity party in a way that no other animal will.
And you know what? I have a feeling that somewhere in there, that is part of the fiber that holds together the indefinite coalition of psychodynamic thought. There's something in there that you are an unfriendly bastard if you're not responding to that, and that it will, as you say, I mean, the therapists and now, I mean, and another just tiny little different, at a different level, process that sits under this is socialism. Okay.
Mhm.
Like a socialistic thing, everybody's going to have a safety net. You've had bad things happen to you. In other words,
But honestly, capitalism incentivizes it too, because it's like, I'll sell you a solution to how bad you feel. Like it's the structures that we've built as humans, political and economic and social, all
Resemble.
reify this instinct.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
I'm
inescapable.
getting at, I don't know, I'm just trying to extrapolate that there was no tectonic plate anywhere in psychology that would move against this. Actually, the closest thing there is one, it's behavior genetics. The behavior genetics and EP actually move against that, and that's why they have been largely run over. But I mean, I'm just speculating now about a huge sociological process, but anyway, yeah, you're pointing out something that's super interesting, that the human has a profit in complaining that no other animal has.
Mhm.
And so that and therefore it worked. Therefore it was seen as under the appropriate conditions, it was seen as legitimate. You know what I'm saying? And so now you can see that the profit is going to be it's going to be an evolutionary arms race between detecting bullshit complaints and are you detecting actually legitimate complaints and paying legitimate insurance fees to some individual that's had misfortune. And that and what I am bitching about is that the people that I have seen that have been I just had one yesterday that can give you an incredible laundry list of all their woes and the terrible things that have happened to them and the reasons why they're having the problems that they're having. In other words, it's obvious to me, oh no, this had nothing to do with the traumas that theoretically started 50 years ago. No, this started in the womb. This is what egg hit what sperm. That's why I'm getting what I'm getting now, because there's been a massive length of time for a specific individual to have learned enough about the environment and to find enough. There's all kinds of fair stuff in the world. You work for almost any corporation XYZ, it's reasonably fair. In other words, you could have a pain in the ass boss and get fired sometime. That's very possible. But when you go to ZTX Corporation, sooner or later you keep bouncing around the universe, you're going to find yourself in circumstances that are reasonably fair. If I hear that you've had 19 jobs and you've been just treated terribly all the way down the line, I know where the source of variance is.
Mhm.
I
have just terrible luck.
Was it luck is just odds taken personally?
That's a good line. That's a good line. Yeah. Or
yeah.
it's up there with unreliable people drive unreliable cars. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was one from Christine Rapucci. That's good though. This is I think I am open. I ought to read this Turkheimer paper because I want to. I'm going to take the time to do it because I actually want to see. I'm not sure that I'm capable of maybe understanding legitimacy if he's got any statistical arguments. He's super sophisticated. So was it mathematically complicated, Nathan?
No, he didn't make as many math arguments. And I'm getting a notification on my Zoom saying my internet connection is unstable. So just in case I freeze. But he didn't make a lot of mathematical arguments. He was talking about he was using language that was more like political, like woke and kind of liberal. And I don't say that pejoratively. Right. I mean, maybe he's just more liberal aligned. And so he's a bit more compassionate, in that sense. But he was saying things like, oh, people had, race privilege or social privilege. And so that, that doesn't account for the genetic factors and the fact that you might have twins that look the same way, they might be just as tall and just as attractive or not attractive, and so that's why they're being treated. That's why they're having similar experiences. Like it was a bit convoluted, but he didn't.
Oh,
Yeah.
there's no doubt about that. And that is an old argument, by the way, that was raised a long time ago. That's nothing new to Eric Turkheimer. That was looked at very carefully by Sandra Scar and other
He
people.
cited
They
her. Yeah.
understood that a pair of monozygotic twins might be having very similar environmental reactions because of their appearance.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. So that is a completely fair thing. Okay. But the and I think that's fine. In other words, I don't necessarily see I'm not exactly sure that we should care.
Right. That's what my question was earlier is how does it measurably affect conclusions in the therapy session or in a coaching, like you, Dr. Howk, the coaching sessions that Dr. Howk does? Like, how do those little disagreements or the critiques of the twin studies, how does that actually affect, how you're going to do your job? Right. And it sounds like Dr. Lisle, you were saying it doesn't really, there might be some legitimate critiques out there, but does it really affect how you're going to talk to somebody and what conclusions you're going to make?
This is the point. Let's suppose I've got somebody that's 105 IQ, blue collar. His dad is a plumbing assistant, and he's looking to do the same. Okay, that kid will have a certain relationship to the world. That relationship to the world will be, I trust what the doctor says, and I use, I can't use TurboTax. That's too complicated. I go to H&R Block because I can't do my own taxes. And I was so happy to get out of high school, and I have not read a book since. Okay. I graduated 6 years ago, but occasionally I read comic books. Okay. So we know who this guy is. And he's average attractive, and he's looking for a girl. Okay. Well, who is he looking for? We now understand a lot about him because of his intelligence, his personality, his very normal looking upbringing, and his probably situation relative to his dad, who he still gets advice from, et cetera. In other words, we understand a lot about the space that he's operating in. We take another guy exactly the same age, 135 IQ, handsome, athletic, socially skilled. He's got his different suite of genes. The world responds to these two guys differently. So in principle, our handsome, cool dude is, when we look at the fact that he may score 80th percentile extroversion and our other guy scores 50th percentile extroversion, it could be that 10 or 15% of that extroversion in Mr. Slick is actually simply attributable to the fact that he's got a high IQ, he's got great social sense, verbal capability, and he's physically attractive. Okay. In other words, if this other guy had those gifts, he would, in other words, that have nothing to do with the genes of personality. They have to do with intelligence and attractiveness. If we had those two characteristics and we added it on to Mr. Plumber's helper, he would score at the 60th percentile for extroversion instead of the 50th percentile for extroversion. In other words, the personality that you might score absolutely can have something to do with the entire environmental context that person lives their life in. Okay. So I have no doubt that that's true. I don't think that I care, but it's an interesting nitpicking thing. And I have to respect, I don't know how much that's true, by the way. And I don't think that there's compelling evidence that it suggests that it's responsible for very much of the variance at all. But it is certainly, and I think maybe this is where Jen's been getting to lately, that concept and concepts like it are certainly worth investigating scientifically to find out how much variance may be sitting in such a thing. I don't know. Does that make sense, Jen?
Totally. And that's the point I keep making about the adversarial nature of this debate, is that kind of work doesn't get done because people are so firmly in one camp or the other that they don't sort of want to dilute their findings in either direction. They don't want to engage in collaborative work that might muddy the waters as far as the sound bite goes. And so I worry about that. I worry about and this goes back to the conversation we had a few episodes ago about the tribalism within departments across the social sciences, and how, specific professors have their grad students in their labs, and they're really just not cross-pollinating anywhere. They're not, these questions are really interesting, and I think there's a fear that they will be misinterpreted or misused by the other side if you start to ask them. And I think they're really interesting terrain, and wish more people would ask them without being so sort of like afraid of what it might lead to in the public imagination.
Sounds like it might be some
I
anti-competitive practices. People being competitive. In the private sector, people
Well,
don't tell anybody how their methods go. They just do it themselves and provide value, and if the market
people
likes
have
it
to
or not.
continue to justify their lab and their
Mhm.
funding and their students, and of course that's going to happen. So, but I mean, the question about what is the practical effect in terms of working with clients, this is serenity prayer stuff. This is like, you accept the things you cannot change and have the courage to change the things you can. And so I'm always trying to tease out with people where's the line, like how much of this is innate personality and how much of it is overcoded negative experiences that you have been getting some secondary gain from dwelling in, or being afraid to challenge, or just telling yourself a certain story about it in a way that's not serving you and that you feel stuck about. Like, let's discover where that line is by running some experiments and getting uncomfortable with things, and then I'm nudging people in that direction. I'm not piling a bunch of literature on top of them and saying, this is the way that it is, and this is the way that you need to think about it. It's like, well, that there's a line somewhere we're going to run into a limitation on where we probably can't run experiments and make adjustments, because we're going to run into innate personality characteristics. But those probably aren't what you think they are. There's probably some noise and fuzziness around that. So let's find out. Let's delve in. So the degree of variance explained by blah doesn't really matter in terms of how I'm practically approaching a client. I'm meeting them where they are and running experiments accordingly from that point forward.
Yes. One thing I want to point out, I've had a couple of people recently, so it's sort of interesting for people to know this. A couple of young women, both attractive young women, capable people, very inherently naturally conservative. And so both of them feeling unattractive, right? And they're not. And in both cases, in other words, my analysis is you are living in unnatural conditions. Neither one of them is living in the conditions that would have been consistent with human nature. They're not living in conditions in a tribal situation where they would have been being hit on every damn day. Okay. They're living in antiseptic conditions that are actually where literally the little workplace situations that they're involved with, they're not a natural smattering of the population. In other words, the people are of all different ages and sexes, et cetera, that aren't necessarily so nobody even knows who the hell everybody else is. They don't know if you're single or you're not single. There's almost nobody there that's in your age group, et cetera. And there is problematic issues with respect for everybody about whether or not you ever come together and flirt. And that could be a problem. Like a male has to be terrified if he makes the wrong move, and now he's, and et cetera, et cetera. So the point is it's like, I was struck in both cases about how kind of amazing it was about how negative the self-inferences are. Not surprising, these people are, if they're talking to me, they're people that are really concerned about that they eat super healthfully, i.e. you're talking about a couple of super hyper-conscientious young people. And so the interesting thing is hyper-conscientious young people in this case, in both cases, inherently, when I say conservative, I don't mean that politically. I'm just conservative in terms of humans. So they're inherently conservative humans. They're absolutely built as monogamous pair bonders. There's no doubt that that's true. And so as a result of that, they are they're not advertising anything that looks like they would be available for casual mating at all. And they are not in circumstances that are consistent with the natural history of the species. Therefore, they're frickin' in a feedback desert. And if you're in a feedback desert, what should you be inferring? You should be inferring that you're not very attractive. That is exactly what you should be inferring. There's no other reasonable inference for those nervous systems to make. And so the fix there is actually thinking through, wait a second, we need to test, and by the way, in both cases, because you're looking at conservative, agreeable, and highly conscientious individuals, you're not going to infer that it's anything wrong with the young men. And you're not going to infer that it's anything other than some deficiency in you. And therefore, and you're pretty sure of it. In other words, those are extremely reasonable inferences based on that. What you actually have is a bizarre environment. And so, clinically, what's important for us to keep in mind on all these things is that people are living in bizarre environments. The environments can lead to vulnerabilities in personalities, making inferences that can be very self-limiting. And that is, I just wanted to chirp that out because that was just conceptually important. It's like a piece of this big mess we've been talking about today, is that the environments, they aren't permanently damaging these in this case, it's not permanently damaging these nervous systems, but it is got them indefinitely in a trap until someday they actually accidentally break out of it. It's like, that's not so good. So it's important for us to know that we could have called it a bunch of experiences that led to that, but that would be actually misunderstanding what's actually happening. It's an ongoing series of experiences in the present that are reaffirming the inferences that we've already made as a result of living in an environment that's inconsistent with the natural history of the species. And so that's another little twist to this whole puzzle. And I think that's part of what you've been bouncing around for a long time, trying to synthesize some of these principles that sit under. And I think one of them is that certain personalities with certain life histories in certain unnatural looking environments, that's what's frustrated me about some of these discussions, is I feel like the general average human being will continue to make CBs that will result in a revolutionary reattribution of some loss, but not necessarily. And it's not that the early loss did damage. It's that the early loss can be part of, in fact, a funny looking environmental structure that we have in the modern environment that may lead certain personalities into having their inferences being siloed and not winding up testing them because the environment is sufficiently unnatural and effectively contrived that they can wind up sitting with a long-term negative inference indefinitely.
Yeah.
That is really interesting.
Yeah, that's a huge point.
Wasting time,
the meta distortion of the modern environment. And I was thinking crosses over with something I was thinking earlier too, with a lot of the repeated kind of what people will think of as self-sabotaging behaviors or self-defeating behaviors that they're linking back to early childhood experiences, or this is, I do this because I go out with the wrong guys because they remind me of dad or whatever it is. There's not actually a cost to that in an evolutionary sense. It's a, you've got to remember that evolution doesn't care about your happiness very much. It cares that you get the job done. And so that also interacts with the distortions of the modern environments and what we might perceive as very costly, that from an evolutionary perspective is actually not very costly at all, or flipped around, that things are much more costly to us that we don't code as costly. And so we're mixed up on many, many levels. And, we're trying to make sense of, why am I doing this self-defeating thing? And it's mutually constituted itself from present to past.
Grand.
Fantastic.
Wow.
All right, our first question. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. That's it for this episode. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel as it helps us out a ton. If you're a new subscriber to our YouTube channel and want to listen to older episodes, I'm slowly uploading older episodes, starting with my favorite ones, the on-air sessions with Dr. Lisle. But you can also hear them on any major podcasting platform like iTunes, Spotify, Libsyn, or others. Or if you want to go way back in the archives, you can just go to www.beatyourgenes.org. Thanks for watching, and see you all next time.